Hi everyone, and welcome to our podcast for EC317, Economics of Race and Gender. I'm Jay Whalen.
And I'm Viet Nguyen. Today we're discussing a critical and complex issue within the labor market, the gender wage gap.
The gender wage gap is often presented as a simple number, but in reality it reflects a deeper set of economic mechanisms. In our literature review, we found that the wage gap is not just about differences in education or experience. It also reflects firm sorting, bargaining power, caregiving structures, job design, and discrimination.
One basic way to measure the gap is through unadjusted wages. For example, our literature review noted that the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2024, women working full-time earned median weekly wages equal to 83% of men's earnings. But economists often go further and look at the adjusted wage gap, which controls for observable factors like education, occupation, and experience.
The key framework here is the Walker-Blinder decomposition, which separates wage differences explained by observable characteristics from the remaining residual. The residual isn't a perfect measure of discrimination, but it helps economists identify what cannot fully be explained by standard labor market variables alone.
And that matters because this course is really about understanding how race and gender shape economic outcomes and how institutions can create long-term disparities.
Second try. All right. So to transition in the interview and to help us think about these questions, we're very happy to be joined by Professor Maria, Assistant Professor of Economics at Bentley University.
Maria's research focuses on education, inequality, and access to opportunity, including topics like school sorting, migration, and long-run economic outcomes. She also has worked with institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank and is affiliated with the Harvard Center for International Development. Professor, thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you for inviting me.
To start us off, we'd love to hear a little bit about your perspective as an economist and how you think about inequality in labor markets.
Just in general.
Yeah. In general, yeah. Not only for gender.
No, just in general, yeah.
Okay, so in general, I think that when you analyze inequality in labor markets, you need to focus on what's the context. You will see that inequalities in the labor market, for example, in developing countries like Colombia or Peru, that are the countries that I work, will be very different than the inequalities in the market in the United States. So, for example, there are some things that are very important in developing economies. For example, the informal sector. So for Peru and Colombia, that are the cases that I'm going to be talking today, because are the cases that I know the most about, you have about 60 to 70% the market is informal. That means that they don't pay any of the social services, they don't pay for health, so they have informal jobs. And that makes the inequality in the market way, way higher, because you will have a very high variation in wages.
Jobs like what?
Like, for example, people that sell things in the streets.
Okay.
Or even like the person that is going to do your nails, if they don't pay taxes, if they don't have if they don't do everything to have like literally a company that like paint nails, that's informal. Yeah. You will pay them in cash. Most of them, they will not declare any income, or they don't or pay any taxes, and they also end up being covering health by the state. Yeah. So they are not paying for pension or retirement,
so it's
none of
different
those.
From the U.S.
Yeah. It's completely different. You have a huge part of your labor market that is informal. So when we talk about inequalities in the labor market, you should understand that when the labor market has a huge part that is informal, that means that none of the laws that you have for the labor market will apply to those informal
jobs.
Jobs.
Properly recorded.
So, for example, you don't have the proper records. You don't know how much they gain in the day by day. Yeah. Of course, you will have salaries that are way lower than the minimum wage. Because for the informal sector, the minimum wage has no effect.
No regulation.
Because it's informal.
Yeah.
And the other big thing is that in the U.S., you have a federal system. So the other interesting thing is that here you have a different minimum wage in every single state.
State by state.
And in Colombia or centralized countries that are like presidential, they are centralized.
Right. It's all
So like the policies are for the entire country. And here that makes that you can do analysis like there are there are some states that work very different than others. There are some states that have maternity leave. There are some states that don't have maternity leave.
Yeah. Right.
But in these countries, everything is like a country.
So maybe there's like less of a breadth of information to analyze then within those.
Exactly. In these countries, you have less variation within the country. Within the United States,
there's so much.
There's so much variation. You have some like laws in the labor market of California that are way, way different or whatever you find in, I don't know, any other state in Texas.
Right. Okay.
So I think that those two things are two characteristics that are very like centered in those countries, and their characteristics that will make that analysis very different.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's very interesting. I'm sure we could write a whole paper on that alone. But just to transition a little bit more into like the gender opportunity gap. So, I mean, in our research and in the class, like we spent a lot of time with like the Waka Blinder method, like kind of, being able to separate, differences within the gender wage gap from, what's
Case-based and statistical.
Well, also, what can be explained, and then the residual, how, is that related to, a form of discrimination? Is it like an accounting gap? In your opinion, when you look at the gender wage gap specifically, what do you think are like the biggest factors that kind of contribute to the unexplained portion, or like the residual after accounting for, everything that can be measured within that gap?
Okay. So I think like, again, it depends on the context, but like one big part of this residual comes from this like tax or penalty that women pay after having, for example, children.
Exactly.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that.
Yeah. So after you have your first children, I've seen some papers that show that your wage drops by a lot. And some of these can be by choice, and some of this is just because the care economy is, in most countries, in a big share in charge of women. So that means that you don't only have a full-time job, but you have a full-time job when you get home.
Yes.
Because you
it's a second shift.
All the care. Right. Exactly. I've seen in some papers, like you're basically working 12 hours a day, and you still get lower wages. So there are a lot of non-observable characteristics that we don't see that are not you cannot explain by the education, you cannot explain by the country where you were at, you cannot explain by the number of hours that they are actually working. Right. But it's this like hidden work that you have as a woman that makes you take different decisions, and maybe you start spending less time on your job, or you prefer lower range occupations. Yeah. So you said like, you know what? Like, I don't want to get to the higher position because I still need the flexibility because I have this half-time job unpaid at home. So I prefer to not have a higher salary to have a more flexible job. I don't know if there's any papers on this. This is just an idea. Yeah. That maybe after the pandemic, that all these tools were developed, such as like Zoom,
hybrid,
and all the like, now you can basically do exactly what you do at home, but you can do it at the office, but you can do it at home.
Absolutely.
Because now you have the tools to do it. Like, you might not remember, but like before the pandemic, there was nothing like Zoom. Or like
there was like
Teams.
Like Skype was
Skype, that it was terrible. It was impossible to connect. So working from home was not a possibility in a lot of like places. Now I feel like I have two computers. I have one at Bentley, I have one at home, and I just come here like maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and I can do exactly the same. There's nothing that I cannot do if I'm not present somewhere.
Yeah.
So that gives a lot of flexibility, and I will expect that maybe that flexibility that we have gained for like the development of these new technologies after the pandemic can give some flexibility to women.
Yeah.
Do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I'll do question 2. So another theme from our literature review was that the gap is not uniform across all workers. We looked at research showing that women are less likely to work at the highest paying firms and may capture a smaller share of firm-specific rents. So how important do you think firm sorting and bargaining power are in sustaining the gender wage gap today?
I think it's something that is very... It's one of the big explanations is that, as I was telling you, that women sometimes they just don't want to be in those places, because historically in some of these places when you have the higher salaries, we have been like treated differently. There's still a lot of like ceilings that they don't let you pass.
That's
prejudice.
Not to cut you off at all, but that was literally what we were just about to talk about. It was like the glass ceiling.
The
effect
glass ceiling.
Yeah, exactly.
So sometimes you're just part of these companies, and when you're just getting into the top, they are two things. One is like getting less time for your life and like less flexibility. Maybe you as a woman want to prioritize something else. Or maybe you're just done with the toxic environment because you're the only one there. So like it's very difficult to know which is what, like who is deciding not to be at the top and who's not being at the top just because it's too much to be at a place that is so like, I don't know what's the word, but like it's a place that is so toxic, and sometimes there are like some dynamics that are like
Toxic workplace environment kind of?
Exactly. Like for like a work environment that you don't want to be part of, and maybe that's why you end up like, okay, I'm fine, I'm not going to escalate the ladder. And also sometimes you just see these glass ceilings, like you can literally don't pass that ceiling even if you're prepared, everything, because the people that is on top, they expect you to have less time because you're a woman and you have babies. So for example, when I went to the job market as a PhD candidate, they tell you, they are American Economic Association, they tell you like no one can ask you about like personal questions. They cannot ask you if you're married. They cannot ask you if you have kids.
Yeah.
Because that will like that's like illegal, because that will make like them discriminate you.
Oh,
but they make some questions, and sometimes some universities that still make the question like, are you married? Do you have kids? Because they are in the sort of questions like trying to be like nice and amicable.
Sure.
They are getting some information that is important for us.
Yeah.
For them as a university. Like maybe if you have children, you're not going to be as committed as someone without children. So like you're giving some information, and maybe right at the moment that you are hiring, you start the discrimination there. So you don't even see the wage gap because you're not hiring at that level. You're not hiring women because you're trying to get this information.
All right, I think we got like 2 more questions that I just want to do. So one big thing is like that we study obviously is like the intersectionality of race and gender as it pertains to discrimination. Just in your opinion, how important do you think it is to kind of recognize that women in the labor market may not be facing all equivocally the same amount of discrimination, especially when you consider discrimination across racial and ethnic groups?
Yeah, that's super important. There is a paper, I might send it to you. There's a lot of like single mothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the like African American community, in the years that they were like trying to. Yeah. So like when they were accounting for a lot of characteristics that they had in the data set, they almost closed the entire gap of for white women with like black men, for example. Mm-hmm. But black women were always with way lower salary.
Because like we actually learned it's called like a double gap. Double gap. Because they're women, like they're already kind of at a disadvantage, but then also like because they're African American as well. Like
that's one that is very salient in the United States, but like nowadays you also need to think about like the migration status.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I think that it adds something else, because also they can discriminate. They actually discriminate since they're like like before, like when they are going to hire you. Because if you think about it, I am a Latin American woman, so I'm a migrant. Bentley needs to pay a lot of lawyers and a bunch of money so I can get first my H-1B visa for work.
Yeah.
And then to stay in this country and be able to enter and they need to sponsor my green card.
Right.
And that's expensive.
Yeah.
You need to pay lawyers, you need to go through a very long process, and that makes, for example, these double like gaps. If you think as a like micro 111 or 224, you are maximizing your profit. If you're maximizing your profit, that means that hiring labor that is migrant and women, it's more costly for you.
Yeah,
so if as a firm is maximizing the profit, hiring someone with that intersection, it's the worst.
Yeah.
Because it's very, very costly. And that makes like gaps in the salary. Like there are certain universities that will just not hire like women and maybe some other university says, okay, I will hire this intersection of characteristics, but I will just hire them at a lower salary.
Yeah.
It's so hard because it does seem like, in a way, it could be cyclical. Like, in trying to do more to try to accommodate it, it contributes to the cost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's so, just like a final question, kind of a broad one just to end on, but obviously for, students in a course like this pertaining to race and gender and economics, what do you think is like the one like largest takeaway that you think is important when considering the gender wage gap? Is an economic issue even more so than a social issue or just as much?
And I think one of the big takes there is to know that there's one part that is unexplained that might be explained by decisions of women. And maybe it's not just because the market is not working, but that women are deciding not to take those positions. That's one possibility. And we hope that most of them is that possibility and not that they cannot reach to that level. So I think that like the big take is that we want to make sure that like the field is level, that we can give the same opportunities, that we try to level up the costs of hiring women and men, and that we can give that flexibility. I think that that's one thing. Also to recognize the intersections between being a woman or having some of these like intersections of characteristics that can make you part of this like discrimination. I think that's very important. I think that's like my big take of like the wage gap and like women in labor markets. Things are getting better.
Absolutely.
And then I have one more question. We're going a little bit off time, but you're from Colombia, like you speak Spanish, and a lot of the students here speak Spanish. And I remember from 224, like afterwards, there would be students coming up to you asking you questions in Spanish, probably their native language, a language that they're more comfortable speaking in. So I would say, like, do you think having that kind of different type of professor who speaks a different language, who might be, who looks more like a student, can more relate to a student, is important to have in higher education?
Role models are very important in life, like in general. There are many reasons why, but like one of the reasons is that for like those students, I might seem more approachable. They might be able to ask me questions that they will not ask anyone else, and I can like have answers that no one else will have. And in economics, there are not a lot of women, and I think that not being Latina, it's also being women that some of the women's, and if you see in our classes when you're an econ major, there are very few female students. And sometimes the ones that come to my office hours are my female students. And they feel comfortable to come to my office hours, ask questions, etc. And I feel like having role models that look similar to you and that you feel you can approach is super important in higher education, because it also shows you that there are many different doors that can be open.
Different perspectives.
And exactly, like you can work in whatever you want. It doesn't matter that you're a girl.
Because, when I think about all the professors, like, you're definitely up there. Because, you're also a person of color. I'm also a person of color.
I wish I took your class.
We have that connection.
Unfortunately. Oh, man, I'm graduating.
Yeah. Professor, thank you again for joining us. This conversation really helped connect the literature to the larger economic questions we've been studying in class. So thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate it.
One of the clearest takeaways from both the literature and today's discussion is that the gender wage gap is not explained by one single factor. It reflects a combination of unequal bargaining outcomes, differences in access to high-paying firms, rigid job structures, caregiving expectations, and persistent discrimination.
And importantly, our literature review shows that the gap cannot simply be dismissed as a matter of women making different choices. The evidence suggests that structural and institutional barriers still play a major role in shaping wage outcomes.
Based on our review, our policy recommendations would be a combination of pay transparency and greater workplace flexibility. Pay transparency can help reveal disparities and improve bargaining power, while flexibility can reduce the caregiving penalties built into many high-paying jobs.
Ultimately, reducing the gender wage gap is not only a matter of fairness, it is also a matter of economic efficiency, because labor markets work better when talent is allocated and rewarded fairly.
Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it.